Thank you for joining me for this dive into philosophy. 2 months ago, Jordan Peterson published his A Conservative Manifesto. I agree for the most part with Peterson's views, but here I, Richard Oberhammer, will respond to a point Peterson makes in the introduction to his manifesto. I add some philosophy, a model of life, that can explain the context in which conservatism grows. I am recording in Raleigh, North Carolina in November 2022. I will introduce my subject here by drawing from what Peterson says right at the start in his manifesto's introduction. I paraphrase from the written text, which he has helpfully made available. In the first paragraph, a crisis of meaning afflicts the citizens of the West. In the second paragraph, that crisis is caused by doubt regarding principles that have guided us up to this point. And in the third paragraph, that crisis is furthermore the consequence of our ignorance about the ultimate source, nature, and reality of those principles, and our resultant inability to formulate and communicate a clear moral justification for their existence. So, to repeat and paraphrase, Western civilization has grown and thrived because we have been guided by some principles that tell us what is important and how we should act. But those principles are difficult to justify with logical reasoning. We have difficulty explaining why those principles. At this point, Peterson, after admitting philosophical doubt, continues nonetheless with his outline to describe a list of conservative values. But at this point, I launch my addition to Peterson's manifesto because I think I can explain why conservatism grows in our social processes. My explanation for conservatism comes out of a theory which I expound, a theory about how life works. And I will say more about that theory later on. But to give you a quick introduction, consider this. Darwinian evolution would foster conservatism among the members of a species in some niches, such as a niche where cooperation between individuals may reward the members of a group because the group as a whole accomplishes something which none of the individuals alone could have accomplished. I should insert here that I have written about this theory many times. I call it the resource patterns model of life, and I have a blog at blogger.com that deals in the entire subject of the blog is this theory, and it's at perceivedorder.blogspot.com. Also there, I am drafting a book, and the first 7 and most substantial chapters of the book have already been drafted, and those draft chapters are available in that blog. If you go there, I suggest you start by reading the statement of purpose page at perceivedorder.blogspot.com. Now, for those of you who do not know who I am, I will introduce myself. I have always been interested in human interactions, and I can claim to be a lifelong social scientist, although my credentials are mostly technical. I have made my living in technical practices, in bioengineering, electrical engineering, house building, and software development. My bachelor's degree is in electrical engineering. I've got master's degrees in business and economics. I also went to graduate school for 4 years in computer science. You may surmise that I like being a student. Unfortunately, I never finished my dissertation in computer science. I wanted to make computer models showing how simple life forms might survive in their environment, and showing how such life forms might start learning to communicate with each other. But I couldn't find faculty members in that department at that time who were interested in what I was interested in. So I got no PhD. But now, 40 years later, I continue pressing forward with that project, which would have been my dissertation. This video is an example. Now, I'll say it again, an overview statement of the theory. Conservative principles of action would help the survival of a population, provided the environment in which that population lives presents some challenges which can be met only by groups, challenges which are too big or too complicated to be mastered by individuals alone, but challenges which might be met if the challenges are divided into tasks, tasks which can be performed by individuals. I must confess about my theory that I've had difficulty in leading others to see what I think I see. I think it's important, but I don't have many followers yet. My theory might not be a single thing, but rather a set of ideas which intertwine with each other and intertwine in ways which I have yet to sort out. Admitting this difficulty, I will present the theory two ways. First, I will describe the theory in general terms in English sentences. Then, after that, I will develop an example, a thought experiment with pictures. So here we start the theory in English. I offer 5 assumptions for the framework. Actually, I like to call these things postulates. I have 5 postulates. First, life consists of individual living things. This is just an observation. As we look around us in our world, we generally can see things which are, stones which we think are dead and worms which we think are alive. We have a pretty clear idea of some of the things around us being living and some being dead. And so I start with the assumption that there are living things, and these living things tend to have an outer boundary or a skin, so that we identify individual living things. These individuals have, in addition to boundaries, they have some abilities to sense what's around them in their environment and to act. And I would assume that each individual living thing can act in more than one way. In each moment, it might do more than one thing. And so it must be it's choosing. It has some information processing capability, which helps it to choose. And also, it has some memory. It has coded in it somehow, one way or another, the experience, its own experience or the experience of its forebears, which help it decide sometimes how to act. The next postulate is living things feed from resource patterns. Now we know that living things need to eat. They're like engines that are running and have metabolism and are using up internal stores of energy and raw materials. So living things periodically need to gobble something out of the environment. And they do this by using whatever memory and calculating power they have and their senses of the present situation to decide how to act. And since we see them living in the environment, we can assume that they act appropriately at least a fair amount of the time since they're living. And notice a logical consequence of this reasoning. If living things survive because they are choosing to act appropriately in their environment, that implies that there is something about the environment to be learned. That the environment isn't just random. The living things are responding to patterns in their environment, which they have been able to learn as well as they can. And we reason that there are resource patterns in the environment. And I emphasize, even though this may seem too simple, this is one of the points that I haven't heard anybody else emphasize particularly, that the living things in forming their patterns of behavior will be rewarded with survival only if those patterns conform to things outside of them, resource patterns in the environment, which must be discovered by the living things. Another reflection we can make about living things is that they must sometimes be unable to decide how to act. Sometimes what they sense and what they've been able to learn doesn't give them any idea about how to act. But nonetheless, their bodies are consuming resources. And so they can't sit idle and wait for perfect knowledge, or any, maybe even a good hint. They have to do something. So there will be times in the lives of living things when it appears to us observing them that they're acting randomly, or they're just doing something that doesn't make any sense to us, but they have to do something to try to find something that will help them survive. Because if they don't do something, they're going to be idle and starve to death. The third postulate is life grows from level to level. The initial example is that I have this body which is made of many, many cells. And according to biological history, there was an earlier time on Earth when the cells of the sort that make up my body, or at least their cousins in history, were the largest forms of life on Earth. These single cells that make up my body, biologists, I think, typically call those eukaryotic cells. And a billion years ago, they were the fanciest things on Earth. So we have a level eukaryotic cells, which we recognize as single living things if we look in pond water. And those single living things have some of the same properties that a single living thing, have in terms of senses and abilities to act and ability to reproduce. According to biological history, before eukaryotes, there were prokaryotes, like another billion years earlier in history. Primitive bacteria or tiny organisms called prokaryotes were the fanciest forms of life on Earth. And eukaryotic cells, we got better microscopes now. We look at them, and the interior of a eukaryotic cell when I went to school was called just protoplasm. We had one word for everything in there. But now, with better understanding, we see in a eukaryotic cell, it's a metropolis of activity of a whole bunch of littler things busily doing functions which we try to understand. So it appears that life grew from the level of prokaryotic cells being the highest form of life to eukaryotic cells, much larger metropolises formed inside cell membranes, to multicellular organisms such as we humans. That's 3 levels. And also, it seems evident to me that we humans are all the time trying to organize ourselves as we go about our lives and our social processes. We are testing ways to organize ourselves to see which ways seem to work best. So life hasn't stopped growing from level to level with us, but rather we humans are in midst of the process of growing toward the next higher level. Now, a question, though, which is likely to arise is how do we recognize a living thing? What is a living thing anyhow? If life is growing, organizing and forming new groups that together we consider as singular things, what's a living thing? Well, I say it's an organization that is fancy enough that it has an outside wall, maybe. It can sense, it responds to things in its environment, and it can act. The whole organization, taken as one, can act in ways in the environment. And also it can reproduce. That's maybe the hardest one for me to explain. When the organization of living things becomes so successful that they can do all those things, sense and act and reproduce, all those things can be accomplished by an organization, that that fancy organization is what I am calling a living thing. And we should notice that these living thing organizations are composed of a whole lot of specialist individuals from the lower level. It's not like an army of a whole bunch of privates, all the privates considered to be equal, but rather a multitude, like a city, a multitude of people doing their individual tasks. Each task being something that had to be learned, that it was a specialist sort of thing. Now we move on to the fourth postulate. Resource patterns must also exist in levels. So I've claimed that life exists in levels, like eukaryotic cells to multicellular organisms such as I am. And for each of those levels, there must be resources in the environment which feed the individuals in that level. So when the eukaryotic cells were the fanciest things on earth, there was stuff for them to eat at, on a microscopic scale that they could find and exploit and feed themselves. And the evolutionary impetus to grow into larger organizations, such as people, is provided by the existence of resource patterns which individuals on the lower level don't have any hope of harvesting. Like I can reach up and pick an apple from a tree, but the individual cells in my body couldn't dream of doing that. So I'm claiming that the environment in which we observe life in levels also has resource patterns in levels of size or of difficulty. It's not just bigger things, although certainly size is important. It's also complexity. Some resource patterns are very complex and not obvious at all. The resources that humanity uses now, like petroleum, silicon to make chips, that was all there 500 years ago. But back then, nobody had discovered it. It only through continued research and understanding our environment have we divided ourselves into the specialties which enable us to exploit some resource patterns which are complex and difficult to harvest from. And now the fifth postulate is living things are limited. Now, this is just the other side of the coin of the first postulate that living things exist. But I want to point out that the living things on any given level probably survive as long as they can sense and act intelligently enough in their environment. So the cells that make up my body don't have any need to be able to recognize an apple in a tree. I've done some modeling of this in a computer, and if the resources in an environment are learnable, then little agents in the computer model, which are really very stupid, can sense only a short distance from themselves and can't see the bigger picture at all. But still, if there is something learnable about their environment, some of them can learn that and can survive. So when we talk about, as I've been talking about life growing from level to level, when we talk about life, we need to realize that we are taking a meta view. We are giving ourselves an overview, or we're using the overview that we have. We're sort of taking a God's eye view. But the individual agents that make up the population we're studying probably don't see at all what we see. I'd say, when you take a tree with the green leaves and the cells in the leaves, benefit from water, which is harvested in the roots. Do the cells in the leaf know where their water comes from? And do we humans who live in information jobs, who if we work in information jobs and live in cities, do we know where our internet routers come from? Our population as a whole accomplishes things that individuals among us can't comprehend. Okay, that ends my list of describing the theory with 5 postulates. You might notice in this ontology that we started with living things already existing. You might ask quite naturally, where did the first living things come from? I started out with prokaryotes. That's a good question, but I don't go there. I think I've got enough of a challenge and enough data from the levels we think we can observe that's enough of a challenge to stretch a theory over those things, over the like eukaryotes to humans and humans to the next level. That's plenty of a challenge for me. So to summarize the picture I've tried to build, life is ongoing, continuing at its present level by harvesting from resources already discovered. This can explain why a surviving species has some built-in bias to respect established practices and traditions. But further discovery is necessary if life is to continue, because resources run out. If every resource is finite, then any living population that's eating away at a resource will eventually use that resource up, and new resources need to be discovered if that level of life is to continue. But furthermore, life might advance into the next higher level. If a population which is getting along okay does some experimenting, just trying various things, then that population may discover larger resource patterns, which are far beyond the reach of any individuals in that population, but which can be harvested if large groups from that population fall into specialties which achieve the overall task. For instance, among us humans, I think we see the sun, which has a whole lot of energy, and we see Jupiter, a whole lot of raw material, and we haven't started using hardly any of that. Life may grow much more into the universe. And there's a point that needs to be emphasized in this description so far, and that is that this is like postulate 5, the limited nature of living things. A group of living things may discover how to harvest from a resource pattern without any of the individuals in that group perceiving the resource pattern. The knowledge of how a tree lives, I don't know, does a tree have a brain, a center, or does just the cells in the roots know what to do, the cells in the stem know what to do, and the cells in the leaves know what to do. They all do their tasks, and somehow all those tasks have fallen into cooperation, perhaps without there ever having been a single plan conceived somewhere. Okay, now it's time to move on to the thought experiment. This is where we get some pictures. I call this the model of tabletop critters. Imagine that we have a flat surface, a tabletop, on which some tiny organisms live. I call them critters. And here you can see I've got a picture of a critter. Maybe that's a single cellular organism. It's a very simple critter. It needs only water and sugar to live, and it manages to survive on the countertop or on the tabletop because we say that the wind blows and every now and then a tiny drop of water or a spot of sugar gets deposited onto the tabletop. And the critter, if it keeps on moving, if it keeps on scouting around the tabletop, enough of those critters will stumble onto water and sugar that they can survive as a population. They're a population of hunter-gatherers. Each critter, we say, can sense only what's in its immediate environment. It's got these legs, and that's the distance it can sense. If it gets close enough to a spot of water or to a spot of sugar or to another critter, if it gets within that length, it can detect what's there, but otherwise it has no clue of what's further away. Now we zoom out a little bit. You notice the critters, here we have 3 critters and we've got a couple spots of sugar and a drop of water. The critters look smaller because we've pulled away. We're trying to get the bigger picture of the situation in which these critters live. I wish I had this animated. You should imagine these critters as moving about here and there, short distances as they constantly scour for water and sugar. And here in this view, I've zoomed out still further. Now you see with these little spots, those are tabletop critters. And the water and sugar on which they survive, they've gotten so small we can't see them anymore. That's something we have to understand as we're looking at this picture, that these critters are surviving by following a pattern of behavior which enables them to find enough water and sugar such that this population survives. And now, with that as the initial condition for our thought experiment, we modelers reach in and do something significant. Here we have the same critters, but we have put into their environment a huge lake of water and a huge mountain of sugar. We know that that's what these critters can live on. Each critter needs to get its little morsels of water and sugar, and here's a tremendous resource pattern. But remember that critters don't have any sense of sight. They can only sense what's within the length of their little legs, and none of them has any way of knowing about the existence of this resource pattern. But suppose we give the critters a few extra abilities. Suppose we make it possible for them to pick up water and sugar, a resource, and carry it some distance and set it down again. So they don't just grab a resource and eat it, but they can also become truckers. They can carry a resource some distance. Oh, and an important point that I make about this resource pattern, the distance between the water and sugar we stipulate is farther than any critter can travel in its entire lifetime. But if we didn't have that limitation, then critters might just simply learn to where the water is and where the sugar is. If they could make that long a trek alone without having more water or more sugar, then individuals might be able to exploit that resource pattern. But that's a longer distance than a critter can travel in its lifetime. We give the critters ability to carry a resource a little distance, and we'll also give them ability to negotiate trades with other critters they meet. So a critter that's near the sugar will probably, bump into that mountain of sugar and can get all the sugar it would ever want. But it's likely to be short on water. It wants water, but it's got lots of sugar. And the opposite is true over near the water. Critters that live there will have an abundance of water, but a shortage of sugar. That sets up a price gradient. If 2 critters happen to meet somewhere out here in the middle, one of them might have enough water to survive a few more cycles, but no sugar. Or it might be near death for lack of sugar. And it might, if it meets a critter that has come from the other direction carrying sugar, then those 2 critters can work out a profitable exchange in which both get to live longer. By trading water for sugar, each of them can extend its expected lifetime because water is more precious to the one and sugar more precious to the other. I expect that these critters will establish a trade route. One day I'd like to do this in a computer model. So far, it's only a thought experiment. I at least am convinced that eventually the critters could accomplish this. You see, between the water and sugar, there is a thriving trade route supporting a large population of critters. Many more critters living in this environment than could have survived in the environment before with the initial resource pattern. But with a route of trading critters between the water and sugar, these critters in this population can live much better than their ancestors lived. They don't have to spend all their time scrounging looking for water and sugar. They can get all the water and sugar they need to survive quite easily just by going to meeting other critters and negotiating deals with them. Now, we humans if we could looking down at the tabletop and we could see the water and sugar, and we might see a little filament of something. If we don't look too closely, it'll look to us like one thing. There's one filament of something has grown between the water and sugar, and we might name it as a single living thing or a single organization. So this is an example of what we were talking about before about life in levels. Whether a large organization of little things is a single thing or is a bunch of things depends upon our point of view. And it's reasonable from some points of view to say that this thriving metropolis of critters between water and sugar is a single thing, a living thing surviving in that niche because all the members of that population are following rules. The rules would be trade honestly. If you meet a critter, negotiate a trade, I'll give you so much water if you give me so much sugar. If both partners in that trade honor the trade, if the neighbors trading respect one another, then this can grow. If critters don't respect one another, if they don't act honorably in their relations with the other critters they meet, then this thriving community can never grow. That's the point I've gotten to as I've presented this thought experiment many times. And it seems to me that right there contains an important lesson that I haven't seen taught in other places. This applies to humans in a way. We live in a society where we can get along by trading with the people we happen to meet while having no idea where the resources upon which we rely come from originally. Or of how they're, if this just shows two resources which are transported as water and sugar, but, a fancier model would have crafts change in the nature of the resources, like a tailor makes shoes out of leather that maybe the tailor doesn't know how to grow cattle, but can buy leather from the butcher. We fall into specialties. And we can become wealthy living in an environment where we're clueless about the larger picture. And with that, I'll wrap up this example. Thank you for joining me.